He stood in front of thousands of people every single Sunday and told them that God was still good. He wrote a song that became one of the biggest anthems in gospel music history, a song millions of people played at funerals, at hospital bedsides, at the lowest moments of their lives. A song that told them, you never would have made it without God. But there was one night, not long after he buried his wife, when Marvin Sapp sat alone in the quiet, and the man who told the whole world to hold on almost didn't. He has since said, in his own words, that if it were not for one thing his late wife left behind, he might not be here to tell this story. This is the part of Marvin Sapp's life he didn't put on an album. This is the part he kept behind the pulpit, behind the platinum plaques, behind the smile, until he finally decided silence was costing men like him their lives. Stick with me to the end, because the way this story resolves, the 6 words his 11-year-old daughter said to him the morning after her mother died, will explain everything you thought you knew about Never Would Have Made It. To understand how deep this pain went, you have to understand how deep this love went first. Because this wasn't a marriage that started at a gospel conference or backstage at an awards show. It started in a 3rd-grade classroom in Grand Rapids, Michigan, decades before either of them ever held a microphone. Marvin Sapp and MaLinda Prince were children when they met, not teenagers. Not young adults who bumped into each other at church camp. Children, they grew up in the same neighborhood, sat in the same classrooms, and became the kind of childhood friends who just never stopped being in each other's lives. By the time they were teenagers, they weren't just friends anymore, they were a couple, the kind that everybody around them just assumed would end up together. They double-dated for their senior prom. They watched each other grow up in real time. Most couples fall in love as adults, carrying baggage, comparing this relationship to old ones, learning each other from scratch. Marvin and MaLinda never had to do that. She had known him before he was Pastor Sapp, before he was a Grammy-nominated recording artist, before Verity Records, before sold-out arenas, before Billboard chart records. She knew the boy from Grand Rapids. And in 1992, that boy married her. Here's what makes this story different from a typical celebrity love story, though. MaLinda wasn't just his wife. She became the architect behind almost everything he built. She wasn't a bystander to his ministry or his music career. She became the administrative pastor of his church, Lighthouse Full Life Center in Grand Rapids. She managed him. She helped set the direction of his career with the kind of long-term thinking most 20-somethings never have, pushing him, by his own account, to actually write down where he wanted to be in 5 years, in 10 years. She treated their life together not as his career and her support, but as one shared assignment they were both building. And that's where one of the most important and most undertold parts of this story comes in. In 2008, Marvin Sapp recorded an album, and there was one song on it he genuinely did not want to include. He didn't hear what it could become. He thought it was forgettable. MaLinda disagreed. She insisted, not casually suggested, insisted that the song go on the record. That song was Never Would Have Made It. It became the biggest gospel hit in over a decade. It sat on the Billboard charts for what felt like forever. It became the song people play at funerals, at graduations, in hospital rooms, in prison ministries. It became, arguably, the most consequential gospel single of its generation, and it exists, in the form the world knows it, because a woman who wasn't even a musician looked at her husband and told him he was wrong. Sit with that for a second, because it matters for what comes later in this story. The song that has carried millions of people through their darkest nights. The song whose entire message is, I never would have made it without you, God, almost didn't happen. And it only happened because MaLinda Sapp refused to let her husband walk away from it. She would not be alive to see how far that song would carry people. But she is the reason it exists at all. By 2009, Marvin Sapp's career had reached a level almost no gospel artist had touched. His album Here I Am debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200, the highest chart debut for a gospel record in 50 years, higher than even Kirk Franklin's landmark 1997 album. He was, by any measure, at the top of his industry. And that same year, his wife was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. Stage 4. Not an early catch, not a we-found-it-in-time diagnosis. The most advanced stage there is, the stage where doctors are no longer just talking about treatment, they're talking about odds. For a family already living in public, this diagnosis didn't stay private for long. Word moved through the church. Word moved through the gospel music community. Lighthouse Full Life Center Church set up a 24-hour prayer line for their First Lady. The church posted updates asking their community to intercede for her. This wasn't a quiet medical battle happening behind closed doors. It was a fight the entire congregation and eventually the entire gospel world was watching and praying through in real time. And for a moment, a real hope-filled moment, it looked like the prayers had worked. In early 2010, after treatment, doctors told the Sapp family that MaLinda's cancer was in remission. Cancer-free. The kind of news that makes a family exhale for the first time in months. Marvin Sapp began publicly testifying about it, telling anyone who would listen that his wife had been given a clean bill of health, that the God he sang about every week had answered the prayers of an entire church, that relief did not last. Not long after that celebration, the cancer came back. And it came back aggressive. The same specialists who had told the family the infirmity was resolved now had to deliver the opposite news. That it was resurfacing, and resurfacing hard. Marvin Sapp went back to the church, back to the 24-hour prayer line, and asked for the most intense prayer covering they could give her. It wasn't enough. On September 9th, 2010, MaLinda Sapp passed away. She was 43 years old. Take a moment with that number. 43. Not an elderly woman who had lived a long, full life and was ready to go. A wife. A mother of 3. A psychologist who was still actively counseling other people through their pain. A woman who had spent the last year of her life fighting for more time with her husband and her children, and lost. The news broke fast. Marvin Sapp's record label confirmed it publicly within hours. Gospel radio stations across the country interrupted programming to acknowledge it. Fellow artists, church leaders, and fans who had never met the family personally began posting tributes. Because by that point, MaLinda Sapp wasn't just the pastor's wife to the gospel community, she was a recognizable public figure in her own right. Someone whose name had appeared on production credits, church bulletins, and interview transcripts for over a decade. But underneath the public tributes, there was a much smaller, much quieter reality happening inside one house in Grand Rapids. A man who had just watched thousands of prayers seemingly go unanswered had to walk back into that house. Look at 3 children who no longer had a mother and figure out what came next. Not next year. Not next month. The very next morning. Here's where most tribute videos about Marvin Sapp would cut to the music, to I Win, to the tribute album, to the triumphant comeback narrative. And we're going to get there. But if we skip straight to the triumph, we skip the part of this story that actually matters most, because Marvin Sapp himself has said the hardest part wasn't the day she died. It was the morning after. By his own account, the day after his wife passed, his household had every reason to fall apart. 3 children, a son and 2 daughters, all in their pre-teen and teenage years, had just lost their mother. Nobody would have blamed Marvin Sapp for keeping his kids home from school that week, for letting the family sit in their grief for as long as they needed, for cancelling everything. But that morning, his 11-year-old daughter woke up at 6 a.m., her normal time, and started getting ready for school. When Marvin told her she didn't have to go, that she could stay home. She gave him an answer that would end up defining the next decade of his life. She said, "No, Daddy, we've got to go to school because Mummy would want us to keep it moving." An 11-year-old girl, less than 24 hours removed from losing her mother, handed her father the exact words he would need to survive the next several years. Keep it moving. Not get over it. Not move on like nothing happened. Keep it moving, carry the grief, and carry forward at the same time. Because that's what MaLinda would have wanted. That phrase became more than a memory. It became the family's mantra. It became the emotional backbone of the tribute album Marvin Sapp released afterward, titled I Win, an album built directly out of that season of loss. An album where songs like the title track and The Best in Me became, in his words, a way of declaring survival right in the middle of heartbreak. From the outside, this looked like resilience. It looked like faith winning. It looked like a pastor who buried his wife and months later stood back up on stage and sang about victory. What almost nobody outside his inner circle knew was what was happening underneath that resilience. Marvin Sapp was not just a grieving husband, he was a senior pastor with a congregation looking to him for strength every single Sunday. He was a chart-topping recording artist whose entire brand, whose entire ministry was built around the message that faith carries you through impossible loss. He was a single father to 3 children who were also grieving, who were also looking to him to hold the house together. Think about the position that put him in. The same week, sometimes the same day, he had to be the strong one at the pulpit, the strong one at home, and the strong one on stage. He was also a man whose childhood sweetheart, his wife of 18 years, the mother of his children, the woman who had personally built half of his career, was gone. Permanently, with no version of this story where she comes back. There was no room in that structure for him to fall apart. Pastors are supposed to be the ones who hold everyone else together. Gospel stars are supposed to be walking proof that the songs they sing are true. And so, according to what Sapp has said publicly years later, he did what an enormous number of pastors and public figures do in that exact situation. He kept performing strength on the outside while something much darker was happening underneath it. He has said plainly that there were moments during that period when he wanted to sit back and simply give up. Not metaphorically. Not give up on ministry or give up on music. He has been direct in later interviews that the despair went further than that the pain of her absence, combined with the crushing weight of being everyone's source of strength while he had no source of his own, reached a point where he seriously considered ending his own life. This is the part of Marvin Sapp's story that almost never made it into a headline, a chart position, or an award show speech. And it's the part that connects him to a pattern far bigger than his own household. A pattern inside American ministry that most congregations never talk about out loud. Understand what makes that silence so dangerous in the first place. In a lot of black church culture, and in ministry culture more broadly, there is an unspoken expectation that the person standing behind the pulpit is supposed to be the most spiritually solid person in the building. Congregants bring their pastor their divorces, their addictions, their job losses, their diagnoses, and the pastor is expected to have an answer, a scripture, a steady hand every single time. There is very little cultural room built in for the pastor to say, I don't have an answer today. I am barely holding on myself. That expectation doesn't disappear just because the pastor is the one who's grieving. If anything, it gets heavier because now he's expected to model in real time exactly what he's been preaching to everyone else for years, that faith gets you through loss. Marvin Sapp was being asked silently to prove his own sermons true while he was living through the worst week of his life. In late 2013, 3 different pastors, men grieving losses and carrying burdens strikingly similar to Sapp's own, died by suicide within roughly a month of each other. A pastor in Illinois, grieving his wife's death, took his own life in front of his teenage son. A pastor in Georgia, privately struggling with depression he never told his own congregation about, died in his car in the church driveway between services. A third pastor took his life that same December. When the news of those 3 deaths spread through the ministry community, Marvin Sapp did something most people in his position never do. Instead of staying quiet and distancing himself from the topic, the safe, image-protecting choice, he spoke up. And when he spoke, he didn't just offer condolences from a distance. He said something that stopped a lot of people cold. He told the Christian Post directly that he understood exactly what those men had gone through, not sympathized with. Understood, he said the pressures those pastors carried, the pressure of ministry, the pressure of losing someone you love or some combination of both, were pressures he recognized in his own story in one way, shape, form, or fashion. And then he said the sentence that reframed everything, that his own story might have ended the same way those three pastors' stories ended if it were not for one specific thing his late wife had given him before she died. Here is where MaLinda Sapp's story and Marvin Sapp's survival become the same story. MaLinda wasn't only his wife, his manager, and his co-pastor. She held credentials most people didn't fully appreciate until after she was gone. She was a limited licensed psychologist. She taught psychology at the college level. She sat on the board of a mental health hospital in their city. Long before mental health awareness became a mainstream phrase in black church culture, MaLinda Sapp was already living it, teaching it, and advocating for it from the inside. And because of that, because she had spent years normalizing therapy, normalizing counseling, normalizing the idea that even strong Christians sometimes need professional help, something remarkable happened after she died. Marvin Sapp didn't have to fight through years of stigma to walk into a counselor's office. He didn't have to overcome a lifetime of real men of God don't need therapy. His wife had already dismantled that wall for him years before he ever needed to walk through it. Sapp has described it as a natural progression, not a dramatic decision, not a last resort, but simply the next obvious step for him and his 3 children to go straight into professional grief counseling after MaLinda passed. Because of the way she had lived, therapy wasn't something foreign or shameful to introduce into a grieving household. It was already part of the family's language. That is the specific thing Marvin Sapp has credited with keeping him alive. Not willpower alone. Not simply prayer, though his faith remained central to him throughout. He has been explicit that it was his late wife's decade of advocacy, her insistence, while she was alive, that mental health mattered, and that professional counseling was not a betrayal of faith. That gave him somewhere to put his suicidal thoughts instead of acting on them. Think about the layers in that. A woman spends her life fighting to remove the stigma around mental health treatment in her community. She dies. And the first person that work ends up saving is her own husband in the darkest moment of his life, using the exact tools she spent years telling other people not to be ashamed of. And once he had walked through that door himself, Marvin Sapp made a decision that changed how a lot of pastors talk about this issue publicly. He stopped keeping it private. He has said, bluntly, that pastors do not wear an S on their chests, no cape, no superhero status. Nothing that exempts them from being fully human, fully breakable, fully in need of help sometimes. He has pushed back directly against the culture in ministry that expects pastors to be endlessly strong for everyone else while never being allowed a moment of collapse themselves. He has said the stigma around depression and mental health in the church, especially in the urban black church tradition he comes from, is something that needs to be confronted out loud, not managed quietly behind closed office doors. That is an extraordinary thing for a man in his position to say publicly. Megachurch pastors protect their image. Gospel stars protect their brand. Admitting you once seriously considered suicide is not a career move, it's a risk. It invites judgment from congregants who expect their pastor to be untouchable. It invites questions about whether someone that fragile should really be leading a church. Marvin Sapp took that risk anyway, specifically because he believed silence was killing other pastors, and he refused to let his own silence potentially cost someone else their life too. It would be easy, and honestly a little dishonest, to end this story here, at the dramatic reveal that he sought help and survived. Real grief doesn't resolve that cleanly, and Marvin Sapp has never pretended that it did. He has said, in interviews given years after MaLinda's death, that healing from a loss like this is not a single event you complete and move past. It comes in waves. Some days are fine, some days, even a decade later, are not. He has said plainly that you never fully, completely recover from losing a soulmate. Someone who knew you since you were a child, who built your career alongside you, who co-parented your children, who was there for literally every chapter of your adult life before you had to learn how to live without her. What changed over time wasn't that the grief disappeared. It's that he found functional outlets for it instead of carrying it in silence. Music became one of those outlets, not just the tribute album I Win, but the ongoing thread of his catalogue, songs like My Testimony and others where his own loss is audible if you know what you're listening for. Preaching became another outlet, a way of processing pain publicly in service of helping other people process theirs. And professional counselling, the thing his late wife made possible for him, remained part of how he managed the days that didn't go well. His children grew up inside that same framework. The daughter who told him to keep it moving the morning after her mother's funeral is now an adult. All three of Marvin and MaLinda's children, Marvin II, Michaela and Madison, were raised, in the years following their mother's death, by a father who chose therapy and honesty over silence and performance. That is, in its own way, one of MaLinda Sapp's largest legacies, not just the songs she pushed her husband to record, not just the church she helped build, but a household that learned how to grieve out loud instead of burying it. That legacy also reshaped how Marvin Sapp approached leading his own congregation. He has spoken about pastoring differently after that season, being more willing to acknowledge his own limits from the pulpit instead of only ever presenting strength. For a man whose public identity had been built on being the steady, unshakable voice singing, I never would have made it. It was a significant shift to also become the voice openly admitting there was a night he almost didn't. Years later, Marvin Sapp allowed his life story, including his teenage struggles, his relationship with MaLinda from childhood onward, and the loss that nearly broke him, to be turned into a TV biopic, Never Would Have Made It, the Marvin Sapp story. He has said he initially resisted the project, uncomfortable with putting that much of his private pain on screen. What ultimately changed his mind was watching how much collective loss and isolation people were carrying during the pandemic years. He decided his story, painful as it was to revisit, might function as something other grieving people could hold on to. Proof that devastating loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. That, in the end, is the real difference between the public version of Never Would Have Made It and the private one. On the surface, it's a triumphant gospel anthem about faith carrying you through hardship. Underneath it, it's the testimony of a man who nearly didn't make it, who has said as much, plainly in his own words, and who is still here today only because one person spent her life insisting that asking for help was never something to be ashamed of. Marvin Sapp has since found love again, choosing, years after MaLinda's passing, to build a new chapter of his life. But he has never rewritten or softened the story of what came before it. He still talks about MaLinda Prince Sapp, the third-grade classmate, the prom date, the wife of 18 years, the co-pastor, the manager, the woman who insisted a song he almost left off an album as the reason two things are still standing today: the ministry that carries her name in its foundation, and the man who almost didn't survive burying her. If there's one thing worth taking from this story, it isn't really about celebrity or gospel music or even about one specific tragedy. It's about what happens when someone in a position of constant public strength is finally honest about a moment of complete private weakness, and what that honesty can end up doing for every single person listening who is carrying something similar in silence right now. If this story moved you, or if it put words to something you or someone you love has gone through, don't carry it alone. There is no S on anyone's chest. Asking for help was never the weak choice. It was the choice that kept a father, a pastor, and 3 children's only surviving parent alive. Thank you for watching. If you want more untold stories from the world of gospel music, the pain behind the songs, and the faith that carried the people who wrote them, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.